Szanowni Państwo, witam bardzo serdecznie po przerwie. Oto w Politechnice Poznańskiej Forum Archiidee 2017, pierwsza premierowa edycja. Za chwilę dołączy tutaj do mnie na scenie gwiazda dzisiejszego wydarzenia, Starchitekt, ze znakiem szczególnym, myślę, trzeba to powiedzieć. Potrafi on bowiem w szczególny sposób uchwycić pamięć kulturową w super nowoczesnych obiektach. To twórca najróżniejszych obiektów na całym świecie, takich jak muzea, sale koncertowe, centra kongresowe, handlowe, uniwersytety, budynki mieszkalne także. Autor Muzeum Żydowskiego w Berlinie, także strefy Ground Zero w miejscu World Trade Center w Nowym Jorku. Słynie także z bardzo odważnego zestawiania nowoczesnych brył, form z tradycyjną architekturą, z kontekstem, otoczeniem historycznym. Ten Starchitekt, mili Państwo, to oczywiście długo wyczekiwany Daniel Libeskind. Powitajmy mistrza gorąco. A zatem nie możemy już czekać dłużej. Specjalny gość premierowej edycji Forum Archiidee 2017, Daniel Libeskind. Maestro, the floor is yours, please. The stage is yours. Please join me on stage. Wielkie brawa, mili Państwo. You're welcome.
Cieszę się bardzo tutaj być w pięknym mieście tutaj. I też w moim kraju, już się tutaj urodziłem. Chciałbym ten wykład po polsku zrobić, ale mi słowa będą brakowało. To po angielsku, tym razem po angielsku. Na przyszły raz po polsku. Let me first say, first project, these are projects about cities, and architecture is really about cities, and I believe that it's really about people. Of course, we need to have materials like Castle Grande's amazing technologies. We need to have proportions, we need to have light, but we must not forget that architecture starts with people and with individuals. And I want to share with you a competition that I won with some friends in Milano. And I show you here, you probably know this amazing city with fantastic architecture running across all eras, you know, from ancient thousands of years ago right through modernity. And of course, I always show this Duomo because many people don't know that this Duomo was built as a result of a competition. There was a competition, European competitions with German architects, Italian, French. So that's Europe. That's the beauty of Europe, culture. Well, our site was on the Fiera di Milano, a site in the middle of the city. It's a 16-hectare, a large site where the Fiera di Milano was with all its pavilions, you know, annual fair in different fields. But it moved out, rightfully so, to the suburbs. And this area, which is really very central in Milano, really the center of Milano, became available to do something. And there was an international competition. I think every architect that I know was in it. We entered with different companies. We entered with Generali, the insurance company. And what to do here. And my idea, and I am responsible for the master plan, even though I'm working here with Zaha Hadid, who unfortunately passed away, and Arata Isozaki from Japan. Our idea was to create a master plan to show the differences of architecture, because we know each other well, we are all friends, not to make one large 16-hectare site divided into a grid and sort of build buildings, but create really a different idea of a city, totally different from the rest of the city. not following just the grid of the city, but creating a green park, really. In the center of the park are 3 large towers. Each one of us is building one. And then towards the edges of the site, really bring the housing lower and lower and lower to meet the historical scale. And in the center to create the network of transportation, retail, and of course, create a lively city where people can work and live, play, and have a beautiful open space. And I lived in Milano for some time, many years ago, and Milano has a lot of hardscape. So the idea of bringing greenery, not just to buildings, not just ecological and sustainable buildings, but to create a completely new master plan, which is not like the old modernist plans of houses in the middle of a park, but create really urbanity in the center of this green space and create attractive places for people to live in and work in. My original idea in this master plan was to create sort of a 3-dimensional dome containing 3 high-rise office buildings. And since Zaha Hadid's architecture is different from mine, so is Arata Isuzaki's, how to combine them through their differences into a harmonious 3-dimensional space. So the space is not only the piazza at the ground level, which is of course the metropolitana, the transportation system, but also 3-dimensionally in the skyline of Milano. Then a sketch for my housing. Of course, it's high-density housing, large scale. How to give identity to this housing, how to create new qualities of space and new qualities that also refer to traditions of Italian living. And I think that's very important, that this master plan and the architecture is closely tied to Milan's living tradition. And this is my tower, which is now under construction, one of the 3, which sort of takes the energy from the underground transportation system to the piazza and then brings it up high to the upper levels of the building. So here is a rendering as it will be finished. The 2 towers, left and right, are already finished. On the left is Zaha, the right Isozaki. You can see the green park, you can see the hub of the Tre Torri, the 3 towers, the transportation nexus with retail really connecting everything. And you can see the beautiful Alps in the background. Milano is a beautiful city. And by the way, in my master plan, I did not propose to make buildings higher than buildings that already exist in Milan, like Torre Valesca, like the Pirelli building. So these are really in the tradition still of Milan. They're not just skyscrapers from New York or from somewhere else. They are within the tradition of Milan's architecture. And you can see here the towers, now they are complete. The 3rd side is just beginning, which is my own tower. And that will be the tower. It's a state-of-the-art tower with really sustainable new technologies. And it's a counterpart to these to its friends on the sides. The housing, you can see my first sketches, how to really break up the scale of large-scale buildings and give identity to every individual. And as I said, the buildings have different heights. But I used the traditional sense of Milanese architecture, which is traditional materials. And by the way, the special tile that I've developed with Casal Grande, which is a gray tile with a texture like the old texture of the stone, is a very unique creation because it's sustainable. It's very robust as a piece of material. It feels like an ancient stone, and yet it is technologically an advanced material. So creating these buildings, my idea was to really use materials of Milano, sense of Milano. You can see those wood-like elements, the screens in terms of sunlight, the very large terraces that permit one to really live outside. At least I think 40% of the time in Milano you could have a dinner outside or entertain guests. And what I did is I created with these large-scale buildings divided, sort of vertically, also a green courtyard. I thought that was important. I love Italy and Milano, and I love the courtyard idea. And I have to tell you, the courtyard really works very well. It's now the trees are higher, kids are playing in it. And what's important is you can see running on the periphery of the courtyard is the circulation. So you can approach with your car to the core of your unit, to a double-story lobby, which takes you into the building. So it's also, of course, you have to acknowledge the car. The car will disappear. Self-driving cars, bicycles are taking over. But it's important to make life very comfortable here and to create a sense of community. I think that's very, very important. That it's not just standalone large buildings, but a sense of courtyard, social sort of cohesion, community, and fun to be here. And you can see the tremendous effort with giving expression with terraces, because of course these are really straight extruded apartment buildings, very, very conventional in their economic sense. But I use the terraces, and it is actually a great effort to vary every terrace geometrically so that they really wrap around the buildings and create a sculptural sense of day and daylight, and give each apartment a very distinct character. So you're not just living in an apartment that looks like another apartment. Every apartment is unique, and you can see on the top are really double-story villas. Each one of them is geometrically unique. They are not part of anything. They're just villas, and I think they were important economically, because once you can sell the penthouses, you have already made the profit you need. The rest is just extra. So it's very important as a driving engine for architecture to create something attractive and something which is desirable. And you can see the housing here, and it's very important that housing not be just, in my view, cookie cutter. You know, you take a square, you cut it up, the same square appears again, over and over again. It's planning which is differentiated. Everything is varying. Certainly not just amazing penthouses, which are totally unique, but also the apartments themselves within the economy of a high-density urban development. The tower that I described is, again, you can see it's connected to the Metropolitana, to the subway system. It's a tower that really is a state-of-the-art tower for contemporary work, with its lobbies and with the elegance of Milan. And let's not forget, Milan is the center of culture, it's the center of fashion, it's the center of finance, but it's also the city of Leonardo da Vinci. It's also the city of the great artists of the Renaissance. So the three towers have that sense of embodying an ideal of Italian architecture, particularly Milanese architecture, in their elegance, sense of form, sense of sophistication, of course, sense of technology. And I think this project has really set a new standard, even though it's taking time to complete it. You know, it doesn't take, you know, it's not overnight. And I'm still building another part of housing, another 5 large-scale buildings. It takes time, but it has set a new sense that Milan is a competitive city. And I think I want to make this point, that today it's not so much nations. You know, you read a lot about, you know, different countries, but really it's cities that are in competition with each other. And cities really have to move ahead, take the tradition of what they have and move it forward so that Milan can compete, you know, with Frankfurt, with London, with other great cities that are, of course, vying for not just economic, but cultural successes. Another city which I love is Dublin in Ireland. And I had a chance to build a private public partnership of a cultural performance center. Now I start here because this is kind of the emblem of the project. It's actually between the theater and the office buildings. I created this atrium. It's a large-scale atrium. It's a wall. For those of you who don't know James Joyce, I highly recommend you read him. He said that if the world is destroyed and everything is gone and only his book survives, you could know everything you want to know about not just the world, but about Ireland and Dublin in this book. Economics, agriculture, society, art, politics. All you need is one book. So I took James Joyce's text. Actually, he created 10 words, which he calls thunder words, words of God, in which he combined all languages. He has them in Finnegan's Wake, actually. And I put them in kind of a reversed way to remind us where the thunder is coming in Dublin. And it's coming certainly from literature and from the arts of Dublin, of Ireland, which is an amazingly interesting creative country, and Dublin is its capital. So the Performing Arts Center is a large-scale theater, but I did not want to spend a lot of money on it, because there's not a lot of money. You know, the theater in Hamburg, which has also the same number of seats, 2,200 seats, costs almost 1 billion euro. 1 billion euro. This theater, state of the art, is less than 4%. 4%, it's 40 million euro. So that's also part of it. To regenerate a city, you don't need to spend incredible amount of money on very costly architecture, but you can build creatively, energetic and energy conscious and interesting architecturally buildings that are not follies because they eat up so much of taxpayers' money. So there it is, on the ship canal. The ship canal was a disused canal, you know, old industrial works, which then, this was the key, how to regenerate those docklands in Dublin. And I show you here the two office buildings, two large-scale office buildings, which were speculative office buildings. We had no clients at the time, in order to support building the private-public partnership to build this huge hall. I have to say that building on the right has now become the headquarters of Facebook. And great, my friend Frank Gehry did the interior for it. And the other building is a big law office. And as you can see, it permitted development of the plaza, opening onto the waterfront, and permitted development of a public cultural building, which has certainly transformed this area of the city with hotels. It's the hottest area. This is not just high-tech companies like Google and everybody moving in, but really the best restaurants, housing, really a place that everybody wants to be. And the plaza certainly is used 365 days a year. There are markets there. There are many, many activities, urban activities that now center here in Dublin. And I created really a very different kind of model for this large performing space. Rather than wasting money on huge bourgeois lobbies, I had to have a very big back of the house, since opera has to be performed and so on. But I really compressed the lobby vertically so that, you know, it doesn't occupy a lot of space. Each level has a public space, and by the way, you can order, you know, a glass of wine or beer, and it's waiting for you on each level. You know, it's very well, efficiently organized. But I made it very permeable and really sort of made it transparent to the public of where they are, what it is, and how to make it very, very accessible to people. You can see it here as you approach it from the street system. The theater is clad, metallically clad and with glass. And you can see one of the office buildings, how it interpenetrates. And again, to make a state-of-the-art office building where you don't really have a client, a speculative office building, you have to use very good materials, high-level technologies. And here you can see how the office buildings and the two office buildings behind it is the theater, and behind it still is the canal and the piazza. But I don't have to tell you much if I tell you that the name of the street is called Misery Hill. It's Misery Hill. This was the worst part of town, misery. And yet, this has regenerated, completely transformed. So with public-private partnerships, one can create, I think, architecture which is responsible economically, interesting architecturally, and definitely something that puts the public back into the center of the city. The public loves this building. There are the lobbies. You can see that they are not in any way wasteful, but interesting, vertical. The theater has very, very good acoustics. You know, you can stand in the middle, and I used to be a professional musician in my former life. So my interest was to make a theater. How does it feel for artists? You have to be able to speak, you know, to be there without a microphone and reach 2,200 people. And so again, that's the key to a good performing hall. And create the Grand Canal Theater as a destination, not bankrupt the city, but create something that is kind of amazingly inexpensive, and give life to commerce, culture, living in the center of the city with, of course, the public space that really makes it so. And it is really, they have opera, they have rock concerts, they have the TED conferences, they have really every day it's programmed, it's really transformed Dublin. So that's another example. Like Milano was in housing, this one is this public-private partnership. Okay, Warszawa, one of my favorite cities in the world. And I had a chance to build a large residential building very close to this gift of Stalin to oppress the nation. I show you this, you can see it here, the scale. Just think about it. After the war, the Soviet planning, the communist planning, really, the area is as large as the historical city of Krakow. They just put this oppressive palace to symbolize domination of Poland by the Russians. And I saw it as a kid. I remember because we had a cousin who lived in Łódź, but cousin lived in Warsaw. We used to come there as kids and stand in front of this gigantic folly and wonder what did the world really mean. So here is a building. It's a residential tower. It's one of the highest in Europe, if not the highest, about 65 stories high. It's really part of the urban setting, and it's not an office building. It's a residential building. And that's the ambition, to build a high-class residential building, which is not just a pure box, as are the hotels and office buildings around it, but give it an expression in terms of turning the building, the base of the building, the parking, the lobbies, the apartments, to really take care of the views you're giving. And Warsaw is a beautiful city, despite its violent history and destructions by the Germans and so on. It's a beautiful city, and I wanted to capture, not just make an iconic building, but capture really each apartment with something spectacular to look at and architecturally interesting. So you can see here from the lobbies, you can see how the building intertwines with the base building and how it ascends and soars upwards. And of course becomes part of the urban environment. And now I'm sure that after a few years, the dominant building in Warsaw will not be the Palace of Stalin. We could not go higher, by the way. The regulation at that time, some years ago, was that it could not be any higher. But it's not a matter of height. It's a matter of how you aspire with a building. And I think I was very happy when I was in the hotel next door, that on their key, their electronic key, was the image of Złota 34. So I thought that was pretty good. If they didn't put their own image on the key, but they put the image of the building. And Złota is familiar to me. My mother lived, actually, she came from a Hasidic family, very close, just a few minutes, na ulica Twarda, bardzo blisko. So it's an elegant building. It's a building that has differentiations. It's not an easy project because towers, you just extrude, you repeat everything. But no, I believe in the individuality. Every individual should be respected. And I think the amenities, Olympic-sized swimming pool. I don't even think there is a tower in New York that has an Olympic-sized swimming pool. And of course, fantastic amenities, wine, cellars, spas, very, very luxurious. So it has really many, many qualities of high-level living. And you can see it here with, in the city context. And I'm sure in the future, more apartment buildings, more people will live in the city. I think that's very important in the center, not to extend the city horizontally, but to build high density in the center of the city so people don't have to waste time and money on polluting technologies and have access to their neighbors closely. So here it is. You can see the shape of the building. That curvature is not an aesthetic necessity. It was actually a necessity of light. The building cannot throw shadows on those low buildings built in the 50s. So the form of the building has to do with how to maintain sunlight on the very low buildings at the base and yet create an interesting building. And I think this tells you a lot. You're looking back into another time. You're looking back into a dictatorship. You're looking back into time when people were oppressed by government. And yet, you see how a residential building can be a symbol of freedom. You don't have to just have a museum. You don't have to have a public space. Just a residential building can be a symbol of freedom in a city, and that's Warszawa. Singapore, a very different part of the world. Now we are in the tropical zone at the equator, where I also was able to build really almost a whole city. This is called Reflections, and Singapore is a city-state. You know, it's a small country, independent country, built really in opposition to the countries around it. It's a country that's struggling to survive in an environment which is very different. This was just a very poor country 70 years ago, one of the poorest, just like Malaysia, but by good leadership, good sense that people should be educated, ambition, they brought actually the city to a high level, and it has many, many great architects working there. I was lucky to win this competition. And I have to tell you a story about this because it's, again, on a ship canal. These very similar to Dublin, the disused industrial areas of the city. I created these buildings. You can see that the buildings are doubly curved. It's not a curve just on the outside. The entire system of locating floor plates, each one is in a different position in space. It's something that has never been done. And of course, my developer, Keppel Corp, said, this is great, but let's save some money. Let's just make one curve on the top. It's enough. We'll save 50%. So they went back to the city authorities. The city authorities said, no. We gave Libeskind permission to build 40% higher because of the form of the buildings. So if you want to get the 40% more height, go back to the original double curved buildings. That's good authorities. They have good authorities in Singapore that really care about development of the city. So you can see the site plan. It's a tough site plan. It runs along the edges of the old ship canals. And the challenge here is how to give everybody a good view, how to give a uniqueness in this site, not to build some just bar buildings, which would have been very easy, but create also open space, water, amenities for people in the city, in the boardwalk, and to create, I would say, almost a Baroque environment. No building is repeated, actually. Every building is different. And that's tough, actually, for architects, to spend time designing the uniqueness of facades. And you will see that no facade here is repeating itself, even though, of course, it has to be a project that is economically viable. You can see the bridges between the buildings, which are not just parks, but also amenities, high-level amenities in the bridges. You've got large open spaces, lots of families live there. Quite spectacular little accents of cafes, recreation, outdoor activities, which are shared by the public that lives in this part of the city. And the importance also of architecture, of an expression in architecture that is attractive. And I have to say that this project, there are many great architects, friends of mine, Foster, Jean Nouvel, everybody's working there. This was the most profitable project and remains most profitable project in the history of Singapore. People bought the apartments almost instantly. And it's interesting because no one has ever lived in a doubly curved building. So where every floor is just not above you and not below you, just slightly offside. So yes, it shows that people do appreciate architecture, do appreciate the possibility. And you can see by doing high density, by doing something very different from the original planning, I was able to save quite a lot of green open space, which is, of course, precious and disappearing. It's dramatic at night, very urbane. Actually, Ridley Scott is using it for one of his films of science fiction of the future. And you can see that the greenery really goes all the way to the peaks of the buildings here and again, it's an iconic project. And I want to emphasize that iconic is not only public buildings. Iconic is housing, and that's the biggest need. And by the way, I'm now working on affordable housing. It's equally challenging how to do, low-cost housing that can be affordable, but is not just a module that repeats itself endlessly. That's a huge challenge. It's very difficult. We're working with several companies to do that. And as a result of building that project, I received another project, very different. You can see it, it's slightly in a different place, called Corals, with different planning regulations, totally different heights, so on. But I did something very different from the normal way of developing such a site. Instead of putting the most expensive buildings on the waterfront, the largest buildings, I put the lowest buildings on the waterfront. So that everybody in this large block, there are, I don't know, 15, 17 buildings, has a view of the beautiful bay in Singapore. And again, a lot of attention has gone into, you're looking at the kind of social center in the middle, you see the green roof actually, which you can ascend, but it's taking advantage of the space and creating a atmosphere of living which is elegant. And I was very happy when I came to open it. It also completely sold almost overnight. The head of the redevelopment agency told me, she's now retired, she went to see it, and she called her husband. She lives in a villa somewhere. She said, I want to live here. I'll give up my villa. This is more pleasant. So that's good if the planners move to your buildings. And you can see here the corals. Again, a lot of special technologies here. It's really smart buildings in a true way, with reflections just in the background, the bridge. So there is still a lot to be done, even in a highly successful environment like Singapore, but a lot of it is about the quality of living and quality of architecture that responds to that condition. Berlin. Well, another city that I love, and another building that I was able to do. You know, my first project there was the Jewish Museum, but how interesting that I was asked to do really what I would call a classic apartment building. You can see the texture of Berlin. It's a corner site right there. You can see it just doesn't look like the other buildings. It's just in the East Berlin, just very close to where the wall was, and it's a corner building, just a corner building, classic corner building. And you know the regulations in Berlin are very hard. 22-meter height, no exceptions, everything has to be the same, and everybody conforms, and everybody says that's the only thing we can produce in Berlin. I said, no, architecture can be creative. Use good materials. Castle Grande, it's not just an advertising, but we developed a tile, which is really like a stone tile that has a very good ecological impact by reducing carbon monoxide, and is very hard, it's very robust. It's three-dimensional. The tile itself changes colors through its sort of chemistry, and creates really a building that is very spectacular because it has qualities of old material. It feels like stone. Like, you know, when you touch it, it's warm to the hand. It's not glass, and it's not concrete, and it's not metal. It's something of the earth. And at the same time, I was able to shape the building in a way that is possible, even within the very, very strict program of the client. The building, again, is you know, it's an L-shaped block. It faces the big security headquarters, sort of the CIA of Germany. On the other side of the street, it's not a very interesting view. So I said, you know, if you can turn the windows and the views, people will actually even take a big and very long and very boring building, and it'll look good. It will improve the neighbors. That's one of the things I believe, that a good building can improve the neighboring buildings. And I think certainly it has done it. You can see here the tile looks more gold at the bottom. Very interesting. And you can see the effort to transform the facade three-dimensionally, both on the surface but also in space, is to give people a sense of ownership of where they are. And by the way, this also sold very rapidly, was an extremely successful business transaction for the client. It has a kind of Berlin feeling. It's not over-designed. You know, it has a sort of roughness to it in the lobbies. The apartments are pretty spectacular. They range from 4 bedrooms to studio apartments. I think there are about 75 or 80 apartments in this complex. But I tried to bring new qualities of the kind of loggia of being in Berlin, which is not like Milano, which needs open space but needs to be also closed. Give a sense of elegance and a new sense of joy of living, and create terraces, create places that have a connection to the city in a way which most apartment buildings don't provide, because most apartment buildings in Berlin have not developed from the time of Schinkel. They are still exactly the same repetition of the same idea. But it's time to always to create something. And I do believe that the fact that people want to pay money and move to the buildings rapidly means that there is a desire on the part of the public also. So the building is really, with this amazing tile, which I am now using actually also in a house. It's only my second house that I'm constructing. This one is in Tel Aviv. My first one was in New York, in the United States. But I fell in love with the possibilities of this tile and its three-dimensionality. It's kind of magic of light that distributes across a sculpture, and I really conceived it from the outside. Though it's an apartment building, it's really a sculptural sense of treating the city the way it was treated actually by Schinkel and by great architects in the history of Berlin. Okay, this year it must be my French year because I won 3 competitions: one in Paris, one in Nice, and another one. So it's Nice, one of the beautiful cities in the world. And the program was to create really something in this beautiful Alpes Maritime, and it's big. It's right next to the railway station, and you know the railway station because you probably have arrived in Nice by railway. It's the old 19th century railway station, and as you know, these railways cut the city. You know, the city usually just stops. You see the railway and you see the big highway. It's the planning of the post-war planning. Highway next to the railway. So the site, you can see it in blue. Large site, it's a really huge block, several blocks. In a part of the city that, if you look down towards the waterfront, very expensive real estate. Everything is elegant, fantastic. The minute you come to this point of the railway station, everything is declining. Housing is cheap. It's kind of the poorer part of town. But the developers had a good idea. Why should it be so? It's just 5 seconds walk from the most expensive real estate. Let's do something exciting. Let's build something on this block next to the railways and next to the highway that is a mixed-use program. It's a building that has hotels, has residential, has restaurants, has retail, has public activities, and is something that also kind of breaks in scale. It's still within the scale, but it strives to provide a 21st century response. I have to tell you the truth. There were 5 other competitors in this competition. All 5 of them created buildings that look like Art Nouveau, Art Nouveau. Arches, very neoclassic, very, very kind of tame buildings, very nostalgic. I had no nostalgia here. I think you don't need nostalgia. You need to have the city compete and be again the Nice that it used to be. Nice was not just a pretty city for tourists, but a vital city to develop this part of France. And it is going to be spectacular. It has, the Apple Store. It has mega hotels. It has living. It has a auditorium and cultural outreach. So it will totally. This building has already, just by winning the competition and by having the mayor and the government really choose it, already has changed the character that we don't want cities that are just Disneyland of the past. That the cities have to also move to the future with their whole history. And of course, it's very carefully designed, very carefully sculpted to really be part of Nice. You can see the highway just on the back, and I can assure you that pretty soon there will be fantastic developments on the other side of this highway as well. Another competition I won, beside Paris and Nice, is Toulouse. Perhaps you know it, this beautiful city. It's called the Pink City. Very low, very calm, beautiful architecture from 18th, 17th, 19th centuries, 18th centuries. The competition was to create a very big fat building. I told my developer, it's not good to have big fat buildings. Let's do something else. Let's propose a tower, 165-meter tower. I know the city's low, but this is the right place to put it. It's on the former, again, railway lands belonging to the French railways. And of course, the idea is that these railways cut the city in half We have to sort of bridge the city. And what better way to bridge a city than with a new point, with a new center, which will be developed. This is not any tower, as you can see. It's really Canal du Midi, which you see the canal right on the left side. Beautiful canal, historical canal. I tried to take this canal and really build a canal, green canal, really in this building, which has mixed program. It has public programs at the top. There is residential, there is hotel, and there is retail. So again, mixed use program. And you can see that it's not just putting some green balconies, but really cutting a river of green into the building structure and creating really an unprecedented building. It's a challenge. No one has done it. We're working with very hard to realize it, because it's a building that has to do with the 21st century. New technology, smart architecture, smart sustainable technologies, but also aesthetically, something that breaks out of just high towers and gives another sense of orientation to the green, because the city, can see this building. If you go, on the street from the railway station, that's the railway station on the left. You see the green in one way. If you're in the neighborhood from the other side, it's another. So again, the building is a kind of spiraling upwards with this, and it is really something that will definitely alter the perception of Toulouse, and that's part of building. To change perception of cities, not just confirm the perception, but make them competitive into the future. And I think when people are able to be up there, and it's a public space, by the way, it's not private, up at the highest levels of the tower, I think one will get a view of the Pyrenees Mountains, which will be second to none, because you don't really see the Pyrenees when you're on the ground. You're not aware of them. But when you're floating up, you will be able to see it. And by the way, you'll be able to see this tower from the space station. When I presented it, I showed that will be the one thing in that whole region of France that will be visible from the space station. And that's a good view. Okay, let me take you to the last city, my city, New York City. And I start here, 9/11, 2001. Everybody knows where they were on that day, for sure. It's a day that changed the world. We don't think of the world in the same way any longer. It's a different world. Where was I? I was in Berlin. I had just finished the Jewish Museum in Berlin. And I turned to Nina, who is, by the way, not only my wife, and not only my partner, but I have to give her credit. I would not do any of these projects if she was not involved. She's really much more important than I am. So, So I turned to Nina that morning and I said, today's the first day I don't have to think about history, Jewish history, German history, because people will enter the museum. They can make their own, experience, what it means to them. And how strange that by 2:30, that it was supposed to open at 7 o'clock in the evening. By 2:30 afternoon in Berlin, when we saw the attacks, the museum announced that it will not open. And it did not open for 3 days. So history is not something you can predict, but it's always interconnected with something else. It's not something that is over. History is always happening. And it's always connected in a strange way. And that's where I was on that day, fateful day. And how strange that I became actually the winner and the master planner of Ground Zero. I was an immigrant to New York, and my first sense of what to do, it's one of my sketches, is not just to build, 10 million square feet of office spaces. That's the program. 10 million square feet of office space. 5 million square feet of infrastructure and cultural facilities. It's in the center of Lower Manhattan. It's a very complex project. But my idea was not to just treat it like any project, but make it something unique, something of 21st century, but something that makes us also remember what the world is about. And I show you this not out of vanity, but out of the fact that the project has always stayed in the center of interest. From the first second I won the competition till today, the eye of people, the ears of people, the mouths of people are concentrated on this project. And it was very controversial when I won it. Very controversial. There were 7 other famous architects. Very famous. Richard Meyer and Stephen Hall and Zaha and Norman Foster and, Rem Koolhaas. Everybody was in that competition. It was a very controversial proposal Controversial because I proposed not to build anything in half of the site. Almost every other competitor proposed to build large-scale structures in the middle of the site because it's 10 million square feet of density. But I proposed to build nothing. And by the way, this was not declared sacred space. This is just a piece of real estate. It's just a piece of real estate. And every square centimeter costs a lot of money in New York. So of course, you have many, many stakeholders here. And my sketch from the beginning of the competition on the left, and pretty much the most recent rendering of the area, which is pretty close, given that it's a master plan. Now, how was this achieved? First of all, I rejected the idea of a megastructure. Nobody has money to build megastructures, and it's not probably even good to build megastructures. So I divided the site, 10 million square feet of density, to discrete buildings that could be built really separately. And of course, Freedom Tower, tower number 1 was built first, tower number 4 was built second, tower number 3 will open in the next few months, tower number 2 has not yet begun. But my main idea was to create really an open public space. So it's 16 acres, 8 acres are public space. That was a very, very radical solution because the developers, and I tell you who the stakeholders are, it's not just one client. These are the stakeholders, families of the victims, which are in the thousands and thousands of people. It's mothers, fathers, uncles, grandchildren, children, sisters, brothers. It's in the thousands of people. They are number one. The people who lost their loved ones from 90 different countries, by the way, not just Americans, 90 different countries. Then we have the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey that has 7,000 engineers and architects. 7,000 engineers and architects. They lease the site to private developers. So the private developers, Mr. Silverstein and others, lease from them. And beyond that, we have the train authorities, subways, path trains that run really underground. So you can see that the stakeholders are massive. Each one has a different agenda, what to do. My notion was, I'm a believer in democracy. I am a believer in participatory democracy. I don't believe that somebody should tell you what to do. I believe you should ask people, work together to garner a consensus. And the consensus was very clear that yes, we will build a public space, we will remember those who have fallen, and we will create something new for New York. Now, to those of you who are architects and engineers, this is just a diagram that the art of building ground zero is not what you see on top. That's very easy to build a building. Not easy to build a high building, but relatively easy given what is underground. You have almost 100 feet underground till you reach the levels of trains. You have to have connections, east, west, north, south. You have to be able to build the foundations of buildings prior to the buildings actually being visible on the ground. So you have to create really everything in the underground to assure that the future is what it is. And now it is accessible. You can enter through the visitor center, which is in my master plan. And there is that image that you probably saw when the attack first happened. And I have to tell you a little anecdote. I was, my studio was in Berlin still at the time. We were in the competition. And I was with all the architects and with the Port Authority personnel in one Liberty Plaza, high building across the site, looking down at the site in November. Gray, November, rain, kind of November day in New York. And somebody said, does anybody want to go to the site? And all the architects said, no, we have a better view from here. But I and Nina said, no, we want to go. So, you put those, galoshes on your feet, the cheap umbrellas. And I have to tell you, my life changed as I walked down to this ramp. I walked down the ramp, 75, 80 feet down, and I just totally was transformed. It's as if I didn't understand what it was. It's only when you reach the bedrock of New York where people perished. And then I touched this wall, and I studied architecture, but the engineer of Port Authority told me that's a slurry wall. I didn't even know exactly what a slurry wall was, but what it is, it's a huge foundation piece. On the other side of it, on the left side, is the Hudson River. It's a dam. It's a gigantic dam. Had this wall fallen, all the subways, all the undergrounds of New York would have been inundated by water. So I stopped, I touched this wall. I didn't have a telephone, but Nina did. And I called my studio in Berlin and I said, forget everything you've been doing. It's not about the buildings and how they look, not about any of the obvious traffic studies we were doing. It's about New York. It's about bedrock of New York. And by the way, I saw myself here because I'm very close to the Hudson River. I was an immigrant on a ship. So I thought, yes, this wall should be part of the reorientation of the site. Now, you know that foundations, we see foundations when they are dead in Rome or in Athens. When things have fallen down, you see the foundations. But this is a living foundation. You know, foundations are built in order to put something on top of them. But when you don't put something on top, it's hard. But I had friends in the Port Authority, engineers, who appreciated the idea. They wanted to do it. It was a very, very skillful and big challenge to expose this foundation as part of the museum. It's called the 9/11 Museum, which has, by the way, millions of visitors and talks about that one day that changed our world. By the way, when Pope Francis came to New York not long ago to deliver his ecumenical speech to all religions, there were people from all religions on that stage, I thought, how interesting. He could have chosen St. Patrick's. He could have chosen Times Square. He could have chosen Central Park. But he chose to give a speech at the Slurry Wall. And that really is a spiritual sense of connection of people right there on this site, which cannot be replaced anywhere else. I also, in my master plan, drew the waterfalls. It's a beautiful design by Michael Arad. But the waterfalls were an idea I had from the very beginning in the master plan. And that was the idea that you should have waterfalls so that you would screen acoustically the very busy streets. It's very noisy around Lower Manhattan. And to bring water, which is an element of life, to all the hardscape. And I was very criticized by the tabloids, you know, Post, even the New York Times, the Daily News. They said, you know, Libeskind is bringing Niagara Falls to New York. You know, what a catastrophe. Niagara Falls in New York. But it's not a catastrophe. It's one of the most beloved places. Millions and millions of New Yorkers and tourists and others visit the site as the number one location, number one site in New York. And beyond the tourists, the millions of tourists, 15 million a year, 20 million, something like that. Since I started working, which was many years ago, almost 250,000 people, 250,000 people moved to Lower Manhattan. Can you imagine an area which was just Wall Street, at night empty, nobody, just shadows of buildings, now is the new center of New York. And for the next 30, 40 years, there is no doubt, ground zero, this is the center of New York, where all the hotels, housing, schools, retail is moving in. So that's one of the accomplishments of the master plans and of memory, because a master plan is not just some abstract ideas. It's about proportions. It's about exactly the aesthetic and mainly about providing a lot of public space. Nobody asked me to do an extra public space, but I always think New York does not have enough public space. So I created an extra space from Broadway because so many people are, you know, our office is on Broadway, just at the site. There are millions of people on Broadway just all the time. So I created an extra space, which is defined by the hours. 8:46 in the morning in New York, when the first tower was struck by the first airplane, and 10:28 in the morning when the second tower collapsed. I created my own memorial in the light of New York through a public space. And you can see here the PATH terminal, still here incomplete. You can see the edge of tower number 2, not yet built. You can see the foundations. You can see here on the right the Performing Arts Center just under construction. You can see to the right tower number 1, tower number 3, which is almost completed, tower number 4, which is completed, the ground zero. So you can see the elements coming together. And by the way, this September 11th, for the first time since the PATH terminal was completed, the entire oculus opened. The entire glass skylights opened, and the light fell exactly as it was in the plan, just straight in the center of the terminal, defining really that 1028 line, the memory of the collapse of the second tower. It's really something that I thought was important to activate not just the light, but also the human spirit. So here it is. The site, as it looks today, you can see tower number 4, tower number 3, it was much taller, pad terminal completed, performing arts center under construction, tower number 1, the memorial itself. That's really, really there, and that sweep of the skyline in the future will be very strong from Brooklyn, from New Jersey, from the Bronx. You'll be able to see that those buildings on the periphery of the site and the central flame of the site. Okay, and I end here. This was one of my first drawings, one of my first visualizations. And as I mentioned, I was an immigrant to New York. And I always thought, what would my parents get from this site? My parents worked in factories. They worked in the sweatshops of New York. My father as a printer, just on Broad Street, just a few meters from the site. I said, where would New Yorkers really be? Because New Yorkers are not going to be in those towers. Those are special people in the media and in, very sophisticated. New Yorkers are on the streets of New York. They are running to feed their families. They are in the subways. They are busy. They are trying to survive in a difficult city. What would they get? They would get the views. They would get the sense of the streets. They would get the sense of memory. They would get the sense of a perspective of the future and of the past. And it's not by coincidence that my plan was really inspired by the Statue of Liberty, which I saw as a teenager, first from a ship. Later on, it was cheaper to fly. And that statue, to me, is what America is about. It is about immigrants. It's about the open doors. It's not about, we live in an age where everybody wants to build a wall, everybody wants to, close things. It's an era of fear. But no, I believe America, the world, is about freedom, it's about democracy, it's about tolerance, and it's about liberty. Thank you.